We're good? Okay. Good morning, everyone. Sunday morning in Indianapolis. How did everybody do last night? Grumble, grumble. We had a good time. Yeah. Yeah, I realized I was giving a talk on Sunday morning, and I'm like, wow, it's Sunday. I ought to preach. And I want to get with the theme. Let's talk a little bit about espionage. Espionage. Welcome to church. If you've ever been to a church service, there always has to be a scripture reading. I thought I'd start this morning with the book of Joshua, which is in the Old Testament, which means we can appeal to multi-cultures, multi-religious backgrounds. Our keynote the other day was talking about how espionage is the second oldest profession. Back in biblical times, when the Hebrews left Egypt, they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Finally came the time when they were going to enter the promised land. Joshua was in charge at that time, and he sent out a couple guys to spy on the land, to check out what they were going to be up against. And they went into the land, and especially Jericho, and they came to the house of a young woman named Rahab, and they stayed with her. Now, I won't bore you with a lot of the details of this section, but basically the king of Jericho found out that there were spies in the land, so he went to try to catch them. So this was about 1400 BC, one of the first recorded incidents of spying. And also, as it turns out, one of the first recorded incidents of the need for egress filtering. Because Rahab was able to help the men escape through a hole, let's call it the firewall. So enough of that. My name's Jeff Mann. I've been in the security business for a few years. Here's my contact information. If you guys ever want to reach out to me. I need to very quickly just mention that after 20 months of independent consulting type employment, I am full-time employed again at a company called Online Business Systems, yay. And they let me come here. So just a quick shout out to my new employer. And by the way, we're hiring. We're looking for consultants, technical people, pen testers, especially mobile application pen testers. If anybody's interested, I've got the blue wristband on. I don't want to get too much into my background, but it does have some context for this conversation this morning. I got my start in this business within the DoD, primarily at the National Security Agency, where I did a few things. One of the first things that I learned at NSA was some of the history of cryptography and the history of national defense and security and what NSA did. And we used to like to quote this guy, Henry Stimson. He was a politician back around in the 1920s after World War I, and he was very conservative, and he very much was not into this whole spy thing, this whole, why would we do cryptography? Why would we do spying? And he was quoted as saying, "Gentlemen don't read each other's mail." Well, we do actually, and we do it for purposes of national defense. I was a cryptographer at NSA. I did a few things like work with one-time pads, and was responsible for, I think, the first software-based encryption system that NSA ever produced, which was simply taking a one-time pad, putting it on a floppy disk, and getting a program to work on that thing, a desktop computer, which sped up the process of encrypting and decrypting, which made the user very happy. I also did some other things with one-time pads, created this little wheel thing for one of my customers. It's based on what's called the Visionaire table, the Visionaire square. What I'm more known for, at least in this community, is there's this book that came out a couple years ago. Chapter 4 talks about something called eligible receiver, which was the first coordinated pen test or red teaming exercise that NSA did against the U.S. Armed Forces. In that chapter, there's a paragraph. I always like to do this with dramatic reading style, so forgive me. Well, it's Sunday morning. The NSA had a similar group called the Red Team. It was part of the Information Assurance Directorate, formerly called the Information Security Directorate, which actually applies to our talk this morning. The defensive side of the NSA, stationed in Phoenix, yada, yada, yada. During its most sensitive drills, the Red Team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and so on and so forth. Well, I was one of the founding members of the Pit. It was just simply our office. I don't know where it got into the folklore. But these are buildings that are outside of BWI Airport near Baltimore, Maryland, and the Pit was actually in this corner of this particular building. But it was just an office with cubicles. You know, we had desks and chairs. It was not a big deal. But somehow it became part of the folklore. Went out into the private sector, did a lot of consulting, advising, and I did do PCI for a lot of years. In fact, I'm getting back into it now. These are some of the customers. Actually, these are most of the customers I had over the years. Not the typical PCI experience. I was with a practice that was helping out companies that were breached in the late 2000s. I'm not bragging. I'm just saying that I've been around a lot and I've done a lot. And what bothers me and why I wanted to give this talk was every time I read about a breach in the paper, and I'm an old timer, I read paper, online, in the media, I hear about another breach. It bothers me because I feel like as an industry, as this thing we call security, we're failing every time another company gets popped, especially companies that and this happens more often than I'm comfortable with. You hear about these companies and you think, geez, shouldn't they know better? You know, shouldn't they have the resources? Shouldn't they have the understanding? And I've been going around to conferences the last couple of years, hanging out with you guys, hanging out with the community, and we very often get in conversations in various groups and settings about, you know, what do we do differently? And there's a lot of theories, and my theory has a lot to do with my background and thinking we just don't seem to do security the way we used to do security anymore back before a lot of this technology and on all the cool fun things we're doing these days. I'm just going to interject philosophical statements through this presentation. My goal here is just to start a conversation to get us to think. So we've got all this technology. We have conferences like this where we talk about how the technology is vulnerable, the technology is broken, and we need to fix it, and we need to, you know, get more people on board with this thing that we do called security. Did you get it, Jim? I can move on? Okay. But again, we've got all these companies that are continuously being breached, and we have a very complex thing that we call security. And in fact, I ask a lot of questions as I have conversations with people talking about the various things that we do and the terminology. And I've been wondering for a while, what is this thing that we call security? I mean, what is it exactly? We talk about how there's a labor shortage. We need more people in security. And I wonder, what exactly does that mean? What is security? I found this chart, I don't know, probably about a year ago. You can almost read it, but it's an attempt to map out, and we tend to make fun of CISOs because they don't know anything. But this is available online. I think if you Google, you know, momentum and CISO mind map, you can find it and actually read the small print. But it basically tries to split up all the various areas and disciplines and domains within an organization that a CISO has to basically be an expert on, or be able to advise, or be able to contribute to the conversation. And there's a lot up there. And I was looking at it this morning as I was going through my slides, and I've thrown this slide in talks before, and I just say, wow, look at all there is to know. How can anybody know that? But I was looking at it again this morning thinking, you know, this is actually pretty decently organized. And so one of the questions I want to pose to us to think about is, again, from, you know, we consider ourselves, and I'm assuming that you guys consider yourselves to be security professionals, or at least interested in security in some aspect. And where I'm hoping to go today in this conversation that we're having is, you know, where do you fit in? Where does security fit into this whole thing that is involved in whatever it is that we're doing. So I want us to start rethinking about security and thinking about what it is we do and how does it fit into some sort of bigger picture. And the bigger picture that we're going to get to in a few minutes, what I want to talk about is what I learned sort of as classic, this is how you approach security, which is called the risk equation. But as we rethink security, you want to get a picture of that, Jim? One of the things that make us hackers, if you are a person that considers yourself to be a hacker, is we question. We try to figure things out. We try to figure out how things work. We try to break things. We don't accept the norm. We don't accept just follow the rules. We try to bend the rules. We try to imagine. There's a lot of different ways of saying this. I think it boils down to many times we're critical thinkers, which not to get too much of my opinion out there, but I think critical thinking is sometimes lacking in our world today. Going back to my NSA days, one of my early lessons was I had a chief scientist in the office that I worked for, and he made this statement, and it kind of stuck with me, and it still sticks with me today, and we see it all the time. In fact, I had an experience when I was in NSA, when I was part of the pit. We had done an assessment. We called them vulnerability and threat assessments back then. It was internal, and we were having a conversation. We were at the cafeteria and talking about things, and I made a statement, and which proves that I was naive then, as it turns out. But I was kind of talking about, okay, so we're doing this thing where we're discovering vulnerabilities. We're finding all the holes in operating systems, and we were having success at it, we thought. And I said something to the effect of, what happens when we fix all the vulnerabilities? What are we going to do? Still waiting to get the answer to that question. But I kind of thought back then, well, if you do an assessment, if you run a scan engine, and you list out all these vulnerabilities and they get fixed, well, then we're done, aren't we? That hasn't happened yet, as it turns out. But again, that's all feeding into this sort of uneasiness that I have that, gosh, we're not doing something right, and what can we do differently, and how can we approach this problem differently? And the problem I'm defining is making more organizations, making our society, making us in general more secure, whatever that is. So what I learned classically was that everything is breakable, and I think our industry has proven that out. Our society has proven that out. What I also learned was, did I get that movie reference? There's an old movie that came out in 1992 called Sneakers. And in that movie, there was these two guys that were hackers, and when they were in college, they were having fun breaking into things for fun and profit and just for the thrill of it, which is what a lot of hackers did in the early days of the internet and public access to the internet. And so there's a scene where they're having a conversation because they got caught, and one guy got away, who was the Robert Redford character, and the other guy went to prison, who was the Ben Kingsley character, and so he got a little bit embittered and came back later, and the subject I don't want to spoil, but and hopefully you've seen the movie. If you haven't, that should be on your bucket list. But he came back and basically was doing hacking for fun and profit, and also sort of to get back at society and get back at his former friend. But at some point they became adversarial, but they were having a conversation, and just for fun and giggles, what they're sitting on is actually, I'm sure it wasn't real in the movie, but what they're sitting on is a supercomputer. It was called a Cray supercomputer, which I actually used to work on when I worked at NSA, which is now in the NSA Cryptologic Museum, which I find very disturbing that everything I used to do is now in a museum. But what the Ben Kingsley character says in this scene is, there's a war out there, old friend, a world war, and it's not about who's got the most bullets, It's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think, it's all about the information. So again, I'm thinking about what we're doing wrong and how we're not solving the problem because companies are still getting breached. And one of the things that I've observed is I don't think a lot of us tend to focus on what is sort of the core problem, which is protecting data, protecting information. What's even scarier is we're coming up with all these technological advances of new types of information and data. It used to be like in military terms back in the DoD, it was troop movements, troop strength. I'll throw in some modern terms, supply chain. How are the troops getting food and ammunition? Troop movements, troop locations. This is all very valuable, sensitive information. Or in terms of espionage, who are your spies? Who are your resources that are turned that are government officials of nation states that are your adversary, but they're giving you information. Their identity is in fact more important very often than what information is they're giving you, or how you're getting that information from them. It's what we used to call methods and sources, and it's pretty much what makes top secret information. Very often it's not the information itself, it's how you got the information and who you got the information from. But, what it boils down to is it's data, it's information. What scares me, frankly, these days, and just in the last couple months, as we've seen Zuckerberg testifying, before Congress, is we're coming up with new types of information that we haven't even thought about, like, our web viewing tendencies, our social media tendencies, our GPS location, down to the consumer level. And we seem to have abdicated that, we as a society, because we want to get a coupon, or we want to get targeted advertising so we don't have to see the spam, but if we're looking for something to buy and we start seeing ads for it, that's cool. We don't see ads for things that we're not interested in. So we've bought into it as a society, and that's the argument they're having as a society. But the point is, it's still information, it's still data, and at the most basic level of this thing that we're doing called security, it's all about the information, which is what Ben Kinsley told us back in 1992. So, from a classical DoD perspective, there's three things that you can do with data. You can argue, and I just want to try to keep high level, but the three things that you do boil down to confidentiality, keeping the information private, and integrity, making sure the information is valid, has to be altered in some way, and availability. And we're familiar with a lot of the things that are done to data in our world, and we call it different things like denial of service attacks, ransomware, fraud, and theft, but it all boils back to these three basic elements. So if you read the abstract of this talk, I'm introducing what I learned as the basic risk equation. And there are parameters to the basic risk equation that I've learned. And these are words that we use all the time, and this is something that's been bothering me because every time I hear people use words like vulnerability, threat, security, risk, I hear them using the words very often in ways that sort of trip over or overlap or get confused based on this happening to be the way I classically learned what these terms mean. Whereas a vulnerability at its most basic level, if you boil down to what is a vulnerability, it is a weakness. I love to simplify things, especially when I'm trying to explain things to people that aren't in our community or aren't familiar with security or haven't worked in the DoD. So a vulnerability is a weakness. We talk about vulnerabilities all the time. I mean, this whole industry is built on vulnerability. I saw an article not too long ago that was talking about bug bounties, and it doesn't matter what company it was, but they were talking about like 50,000 vulnerabilities that they processed or evaluated, whatever period of time it was. who can keep up with 50,000 anything? Um, and again, that makes me concerned because we seem to be very focused on vulnerabilities all the time, but yet they're not going away, because what can be created by them is broken. Threats is another big one that bothers me, because threats are, I think in most of our vernacular, threats are the things that are happening on our computer, the bots, the malware, the attacks, and it always kind of bugs me because the way I learned what threats were was it's people. It's the ones that are trying to do bad things to you. It's the adversary. And a lot of times, I translate it in my head, a lot of times what I'm hearing in people discussing threats, I'm hearing, well, you're really talking about attacks. That's what the threats are doing. And I'm not saying that we need to, everybody agree on the terms that I understand and use my definitions, but I want us, and I think it's important to, when we use these terms, have a broader understanding that ties back to the historical element of where these terms came from. The third element is countermeasures. Countermeasures are, think of the word, counter. It's an action and a reaction. It's a response. It's a mitigation. And that's a lot of what we do in security. So I say countermeasures, that's the way I was trained. When you hear countermeasures, it's okay to think security in your head. So what does this look like? If you Google risk equation, you'll get hundreds, if not thousands, of variations. And they're usually mathematical formulas. And they've been used in our industry over the last 20, 25 years because a lot of times companies want to figure out how well they're doing. So they want to have a score. They want to have a measure. So how do you get a score? How do you get a measure? You come up with some sort of mathematical formula. So again, I try to simplify things. I'm using simple addition here. But if any mathematicians in the audience, good, I won't embarrass myself. You can also think of it as not just an equation, but a function. That risk, whatever this thing is, this risk, and we'll talk about the definition of that, ultimately, is a function of vulnerabilities, the things that are the weaknesses in your organization, in your system, in your business, the threats, the people that might want to do you harm, and then what you do to prevent, mitigate, protect against the threats and the vulnerabilities. Does that all make sense so far? My Bible from my DoD days is something called the National Information Systems Security, or InfoSec Glossary. This was this version, which was the one that I used, was published in 2000. I think you can find this online. In fact, I know you can. I got the screenshot of the PDF file. This is a book that has a glossary of every term you can think of in terms of the world that we live in. Somewhat dated, it's not necessarily talking about mobile, but then again, mobile is a signal. It's going through the air. Guess what we used to do 30, 40 years ago when I was in the DoD and everything's now in the museum? We were doing signals. It was radio signals rather than cellular signals, but it was still a signal. So I pulled the definitions from this glossary just to give us a framework to work with for this discussion. So risk is the possibility that a particular threat will adversely impact an information system by exploiting a particular vulnerability. A lot of big words, and it's already, in my mind, tainted by leaning towards the technology thing. Whereas, again, when I first started doing this, the risk was basically the possibility or the likelihood that something bad's going to happen. So put that in a commercial context. Most of you guys are probably employed. Your companies are in business, and that business is to do something, produce goods and services, earn revenue, make a living, make money. What are the bad things that can happen to your company? that should really be the beginning of every discussion of security within your organization. Or if you're someone like me that's a consultant that goes out and talks to other companies and tries to help them with their security programs, it should always start with, what are you worried about? At the most basic level, what most companies are worried about is the ability to make money, the ability to keep customers, the ability to have the edge on their competition. It all boils down to money, which is actually significantly different from the way I learned about security in the national security DoD sense, which was the risks that we're worried about was basically human life. You know, we're worried about our troops dying. We're worried about our citizens that are abroad in other countries, things like that. But in a commercial sense, it pretty much all boils down to money. We need to accept that. It's not a right or wrong thing. It's okay for companies that exist and make money. That's how we get food on our table. We're all part of this economic system. But the economic forces that attack our companies, our organizations that we work for, need to be understood. And also you need to understand that a lot of those things you can't control ultimately. So that's the beginning of understanding at the most basic level. The risk is our company is unable to do business. Our company is unable to generate revenue. Our company loses something. Our company gets fined because we have had data about from our customers stolen. Yeah, and so on and so forth. So threat. The InfoSec glossary definition of threat. I'm not going to read it to you. You guys mostly probably know how to read. And again, this is touching on a technology perspective where it goes from the who, but also to an event, which is okay. I'm fine with that. When I first started in consulting, after I left the government back in the late 90s, we basically, the group that I worked with, we went around trying to explain to companies how to do security the DoD way, because DoD does security. And we went out to companies that had never done security before because they were, grocery stores, they were gas stations, they were restaurants, they were power companies, they were insurance companies, so on and so forth. And they hadn't really had to think about security before until they plugged into the internet, and then all hell broke loose. So this slide is actually one from my archives. It's 20 years old. My questions to you guys is, how well does that stand up today? What's different? Is there anything different? Anybody think of something that's a threat that isn't listed up there in some way, shape, or form? Or the reason why they do it? I think the answer is no. You can argue with me, that's fine. But I put this up there to just underscore the fact that there's not really a lot new going on here. We have new methods, maybe. But the threats, if you think of the who's, the bad guys, the events, that really hasn't changed. I think in the early days, back in the late 90s, a lot of the bad guy activity, the attacker activity, was much more down in the thrill and challenge type of thing. But as you learned from our keynote the other day, there was also this espionage going on. There's this element of this whole security thing with threats that are very real and very active and happening all the time. Not necessarily to your company, your organization, but it's certainly out there. So then vulnerability. Pretty good definition, and it takes weakness, that key word, and expresses it across systems. But notice it's not just technical weaknesses. It's weaknesses in procedure. It's weaknesses in the controls. It's weaknesses in the people that are using these systems, which again I think is significant. And we talk about it to some degree in this community, but it's usually in the context of seated users, muggles, them versus us. We're in the know, they're not, which I would simply say, educate, explain it to you. So I had Spectre and Meltdown in the title, not because I wanted to talk about them, but because when we discover a vulnerability, and these are 3 examples, of course vulnerabilities have to have logos these days. Does everybody know what they are? Do you know what this one is? Shell shock, heartbeat. And Spectre, Meltdown. I put these three up as examples of vulnerabilities that were discovered in technologies that the vulnerabilities have pretty much been there since the beginning for 10, 15, 20 years. The shell shock was painful because back in the early days when I was getting started, we loved using the bash shell. The bash shell was so cool. It had so much functionality. It was so superior to other shells that were out there. And we trusted it, and it was open source because that's more secure. And then you find out that there's a vulnerability in it that's been there since the very beginning. Again, as a professional in this business, a long-time professional, I asked the question, how good are we when this is crap like this? The shell shot, the Spectre Meltdown, sort of a similar thing, but what do you do when there's a vulnerability that fundamentally can't get fixed, and it's there? Which again fed into this. We need to have a discussion about what do you do if the exercise isn't simply patch, isn't simply get rid of the vulnerability, which is something that we've been struggling with as an industry for the last 25 years. So then finally, countermeasure security. It's what you do to respond. Okay. So we're being recorded, so it doesn't really play well. But my goal is with this, is that all of us that are listening, all people that listen to this later, start talking to one another. The questions that I want to ask, that we can't actually have the dialogue here too well, is when you look at the risk equation, and I'm putting a version up here that sort of applies to the commercial context, where money comes into play. When you look at the risk equation and you think about all the things that we do in this industry that are focused on vulnerabilities, and if you look at this equation and you see vulnerability as one variable, and then there's this other variable off to the side that's I call countermeasures, but for the sake of argument we call security. My question is, if we're focused on vulnerabilities, is that really security at all? Because security is another variable. Same goes for threats. We're figuring out the who's and the what's of the bad things that can happen to us, and we're focused on that, which is a valid activity, but is it really security if security is something else? So the question then is twofold. What is the something else? And the question I want each of us to ask individually, think about what it is that you do in the community, assuming that say that you're part of the security community. What is it that you do and where does it fit into this equation? And by definition, is it really security? So think about that a minute. For example, maybe somebody can shout out and be a guinea pig. What is it you do for a living if you consider yourself a part of the security community? And maybe we can walk through it. Does anybody want to volunteer? Anybody think, damn it, I do security? So let's talk it out. Threat intelligence. Can you expound on what that is just in day-to-day terminology without giving away the thought? Okay. Let me pause a minute because I want to rephrase what you say so it gets on. So you say you do threat intelligence, and so you work with vulnerability management team, you evaluate vulnerabilities, and you look at them to see how they relate to threats. Keep going. How they relate to your organization. Do they impact your organization? So there's a vulnerability that comes out. Do we have systems that are running whatever it is that the vulnerability is associated? Do we care? Do we need to go do something about it? That type of thing. So So you're tying it to threat actors, what I call threats, who I call threats. Are they using this vulnerability in the wild? Is it weaponized? Are there exploits out there? So again, another element of, do we need to worry about it? Okay. Okay. And is the threat actor known to target my industry? Okay, that's great. So let's walk through this. This is an experiment. This is a conversation. So you're looking at vulnerabilities, and you're trying to be aware of the threat to decide whether you need to do something about it. Okay, so I didn't say, and hopefully it's intuitive, that in this equation, the goal is to get your risk score, whatever it is, whatever the value is, lower. You want to lower your risk. I think that's intuitive, but I want to make sure we make that clear. And so in any mathematical formula that has variables, if you want to make the resulting number lower, these other numbers somehow need to go down. Make sense? So vulnerabilities, whether they're 100 or 1,000 or 50,000, you want to reduce that score, and somehow that's going to impact your overall risk score. Same with the threats. However many threats there are, threat actors that are out there, and are they focused on you? I mean, it almost sounds like in this context, it might be a 1 or 0 type of thing. Here's a threat category, nation state. Are they going to do something to us? Are they likely to hit our industry, our organization? Yes or no? So you can build a formula, an equation that way. And then the countermeasures element, I should have said, is something that is applied that maybe artificially drives these other numbers down, whatever these other numbers are. So it's not necessarily eliminating the vulnerability count itself, but it does something to offset the vulnerability count or the threat count. So what you have described, you're focused on vulnerabilities, you're focused on threats, it fits into that score, but is anything that you do, by definition, work with me, fall into the bucket of security? Yes? Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the research you're doing to determine what your values are for these two variables are then fed into a security function or security team to determine A, whether you can eliminate and make the vulnerability or the threat go away, or if you can't, what are you going to do about it? That's perfect. Security, in that sense, is kind of the whole thing working together. But the whole thing working together isn't security, it's risk. And I'm playing on words here, and I don't want to get hung up on it, but again, I'm trying to get us to rethink how we look at this in hopes that maybe it'll make things better and it'll help us do our job better and help us focus better. But I like what you said, I like how you described it, and it fits into this overall equation, but this overall equation has to do with risk. What are the bad things that could happen to our organization? And security in that sense is just one aspect, one element of the overall process. Now, can you say, assuming that you can't make the vulnerabilities or threats go away with what you've identified, what are the types of things that your organization would do that's security or countermeasure? Okay. So blocking, that's a response. Okay. You're looking for a detection capability. Okay. Yep. Right. Okay. Does that make sense to everybody? Security in this context, and this is kind of what I'm driving at, is much more focused on a detection, response, recovery element.
it's all related. The exercises that they're doing in terms of evaluating vulnerabilities, evaluating the threats, are all related, and it all fits into this thing that we're doing. But this thing that we're doing at the highest level is about risk, whereas security is a subcomponent. And this is the point that I'm getting at, is we have all these terms and we jumble them around and we refer to one as the other, and we use other terms to describe and define the different terms, and we all call it security, but at the end of the day it's really risk. Does that matter at the end of the day? I don't know. But to me, if we clarify and understand what we do and how it fits into an overall equation, I'm hoping that means it makes us better at understanding what we do. And I hope it makes us more sensitive when we're saying in our organization, those stupid users, they're doing things wrong, why are they doing it? They're making my life hell. Or those developers, they need to write secure code, it's their fault. There ends up being a lot of finger pointing, frankly, in our industry. And that's something I'm trying to move beyond, because it's ultimately not helpful, I don't think. We have this problem that we collectively need to solve. Maybe if we all have an agreed upon terminology and we all understand how we fit into the bigger picture, maybe that helps us be more successful. That makes sense. I'm not saying agree with me. In fact, I don't want you to agree with me. I want you to think about it. Any questions? Comment? Pushback? Yes, sir.
What would you say is counterpart?
Mm-hmm. A very loaded question. Well, I need to try to restate the question on the mic, and it was a very long question. Say it once more. What's a good counterpart in an organization to help the discussion of getting people to understand security beyond whatever it is in the organization that's called security, as it relates to the organization? So, what I hear you asking is, how do you get everybody in the organization on board with security? My theory is, and I give another talk called Does DoD Security Work in the Real World, in which I tell the story of when I got started in the DoD, the whole culture of the organization that I worked for was security, because it was kind of the business that we were in. And I think one of the elements that is not translated very well from the DoD world into the commercial world is this idea of security as part of the culture of the corporate organization in which you fall. So where I've always attempted to take that question is start from the top. You need to have executive buy-in to, we're going to do security. But in saying that, they need to express what that means to the organization. We are a retailer, a merchant, a manufacturer. We make widgets. We sell widgets. Whatever it is, we have information. We have product to protect. We value our customers, and security relates to this because we want to keep our customers. We want to keep our proprietary nature of our product so we can sell the better product than the next guy. Express it as a part of basically the business function. Because, if you think back to the risk equation, security, what we do that all kind of somehow jumbles around and we call it security, is all over the map. Well, in the same way, security needs to be all over the map of all the business processes and things that go on in an organization. That's a cultural shift. That's a mindset. That's getting beyond the once a year, I'm going to, do my security awareness training and listen, watch the video and answer the 10 questions, or get the occasional, phishing email attempts. Congratulations, you didn't click the link, or shame on you, you clicked the link. Let me give you remedial training. Not saying that that's not important. I'm just saying that that's not enough to make a cultural shift. Security needs to be understood by everybody. The analogy I give in my other talk, and I don't want to take the time to do it here, but basically everybody in the organization where I first worked understood their role, understood where their role fit into the big picture of what the organization was trying to accomplish, understood that there was rules and processes in place that were security related, and they may not have understood the big picture, but they understood that what they did, no matter how large or small it was important, and it was part of the whole machine. Every little thing helps. Every little thing is part of it. It's a system. It's a cultural thing. Does that address your question at all? I'm not even sure when we're supposed to cut off, but I'm assuming it's soon. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? Does any of this make sense, yes or no? Does it make you want to think, and hopefully let's talk about it? When you hear the word threat or vulnerability or risk, ask the person that's saying the word, or any of the variations that we have as buzzwords these days, ask them what they mean by it. Ask them what they mean by it give them a context. Well, I work for a company that's this. What does that mean in my context? Just go out in this conference and just ask 50 people, 10 people, 5 people, hey, what's a vulnerability? And see what they say. I would bet you $1 that you get however many people that you ask the question, you'll get that many answers. And there might be overlaps and some similarities, but I'll bet you get different answers. Context is everything, and most of us don't have an overall context. I'm generalizing perhaps. So my goal here, hopefully this helps you to maybe think differently about what it is we're doing, what it is you're doing. I'm hoping it makes you ask questions. What is I'm doing? What is what I do? How does it fit into the big picture, especially in the context of this thing that we call the risk equation, this thing that we're trying to prevent bad things from happening, and how do we go about doing that, or how do we minimize the impact of the bad thing when it does happen? So that's my charge, my admonition to you as you go forth, my congregation. Think about what it is we're doing. Try to understand the terminology. Don't necessarily mean that you have to make it my terminology, make it my definition, but make sure that when you're having conversations that you're speaking the same language, that you understand some sort of general context of what the words are. All right? That's it for me. I thank you guys for showing up on Sunday morning and listening to me. We'll be passing the collection plate now. All right, thanks.